Good afternoon and welcome to the African American Heritage House and the 2021 CHQ Assembly. My name is Errol Davis and I have the distinct honor and privilege of serving as president of the African American Heritage House here at Chautauqua, or AAHH as we fondly refer to it. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this 9th of 10 lectures that the AAHH will sponsor or co-sponsor with the institution during this assembly season. We are a diverse support organization which is informed by the African American experience. We're committed to strengthening Chautauqua, and we do this in a variety of ways by encouraging and certainly welcoming diversity, by fostering honest conversations such as the Mirror Project, and by adding robust new voices to the programmatic mix, one of which you will hear today. Pardon me. Our focus over the last few years has been primarily on getting the narrative correct. Our view is that we must get the history correct, to get the understandings correct, to get the future relationships correct. It's that simple. It all starts with history. It is therefore imperative that we own both our past as well as our present. Thus, we are committed to telling the stories that need to be told, and we do this primarily from the perspective of historically marginalized people. I encourage all of our visitors to visit our website, which you see on the screen, aaheritagehouse.org. There you will learn how you can support and even become involved in our work. As we are entirely supported by contributions, I want to thank our many friends and patrons for making possible all that we have been able to do over the last 3 years. Without the generosity of our friends and supporters, their advice and counsel, as well as their financial support, we would be unable to have the kind of impact at Chautauqua that we have had over the years and are doing so again this season. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for supporting this work. Today's program is dedicated to the memory of Sue Hammond Innes. Sue was a beautiful soul who left us far too soon. She was a stalwart advocate of social justice issues and a strong supporter of the African American Heritage House. We will dearly miss her calm presence and her sage advice. This week's thematic focus at Chautauqua is on the human brain, our greatest mystery. Today, our speaker is Dr. Carl L. Hart, Ziff Professor at Columbia University and former chair of the Department of Psychology. Dr. Hart is one of the world's preeminent experts on the effects of so-called recreational drugs on the human mind and body. Dr. Hart has published more than 100 scientific articles in the area of neuropsychopharmacology. He has also published multiple books, including High Price, a neuroscientist's journey of self-discovery that challenges everything you know about drugs and society. That book won the 2014 Penn/E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. His most recent book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear, is changing the national conversation on drug use. Dr. Hart has appeared on multiple podcasts, radio, and television shows. His essays have been published in numerous popular publications, including the New York Times, Scientific American, The Nation, Ebony, and O Globo. He has been the recipient of numerous awards, and in 2016, the city of Miami issued a proclamation declaring February 1st, 2016, Dr. Carl Hart Day. I am honored that he has agreed to share his thoughts with us here today, and I know that you're going to find his remarks both enjoyable and enlightening. However, before we begin today's lecture, our audience should know that you may submit questions for our live Q&A with Dr. Hart through the submission portal, questions.chq.org, which again is shown on your screen at the moment. You can do this from any mobile or desktop browser. If you use Twitter, just use the hashtag CHQ2021. Today's remarks were pre-recorded. However, as I noted, they will be followed by live Q&A with Dr. Hart, who is in Geneva, Switzerland today, but the questions will be submitted by our live audience tuning in from around the world. I will be assisted in an interview process by my colleague and fellow board member, Ernie Mahaffey. So, my fellow Chautauquans, the AAHH is pleased. We're pleased to present to you Dr. Carl L. Hart.
Hi, I'm Carl Hart, a professor at Columbia University. And today I'll be giving a talk entitled, Viewing Addiction as a Brain Disease Promotes Social Injustice. When I say viewing drug addiction as a brain disease, I simply mean that people who are addicted have pathologies in their brains versus those who are not addicted. When I say pathology, I just mean differences that we don't see in people who don't use drugs. That's all I mean. Now, before I begin my talk, it's important for me to start with a quote from James Baldwin. The quote is related to a journey because that's exactly what I did over the course of my scientific career. James Baldwin has said that you cannot know what you will discover on a journey, and what you will do with what you find or what you find will do to you. And that's exactly what happened to me, because I started out on this journey thinking that I would find the neural substrates or the neural mechanisms that differentiate those people who are addicted from those who are not addicted. I thought that drug addiction, specifically crack cocaine addiction, was the source of the problems that I saw in my community. In other words, I thought that crack cocaine was responsible for high unemployment rates, poor education, and so forth. So I reasoned that if I studied drug addiction or studied the effects of drugs on the brain and figured out a way to solve drug addiction, I could therefore solve the problems that I saw in my community. This simple rationale kind of propelled my career. So in the 1990s, I decided to get a PhD in neuroscience. I wanted to figure out how drugs exerted their effects on the brain. I figured that if I could understand how drugs exert their effects on the brain, then I could probably help solve the problem of drug addiction. And if I could help solve the problem of drug addiction, then I could solve the problems that I thought were related to drug addictions in my community. And so I started publishing a number of papers in this area, looking at the effects of nicotine, morphine, cocaine on the effects on certain neurons in the brain. And then over the course of about a 20-year period, using this sort of rationale or operating under this theory, I have discovered that perhaps it's not the most effective way in order to treat or alter drug-taking behavior, or treat drug addiction or alter drug-taking behavior. The most effective way to treat drug addiction or alter drug-taking behavior seems to be behavioral manipulations. And when you look at the symptoms or the criteria for judging drug addiction, those symptoms are delineated in the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. And there are 11 symptoms, and those symptoms are things like people are craving, they spend a great deal of time in activities necessary to obtain or use or recover from the substance. They continue their substance use despite persistent social problems, interpersonal problems. Some may have tolerance. Some people may have withdrawal symptoms. People may not meet their obligations, like work obligations or family obligations. So there are a number of these symptoms, 11 in fact, and if a person endorses a certain amount of symptoms, we then say that they meet criteria for drug addiction. Notice that there is no measurement or no conversation there or no symptom related to the brain. These are all behavioral symptoms. But yet and still, we tend to think of drug addiction as a brain disease. So the question becomes, why? And I'm going to address that question in a second. But before doing so, I just want to point out also that the vast majority of people who use drugs, 75 to 90% of them, will never have or never meet criteria for drug addiction. And so if we know that most people who use drugs don't become addicts, then we can't blame drugs. We must look beyond the drugs and look at other sort of factors that may be responsible for drug addiction. Those factors are things like co-occurring illnesses, whether they are co-occurring mental illnesses like depression, schizophrenia, co-occurring pain issues like someone in chronic pain. People who have these co-occurring illnesses are more likely to meet criteria for addiction. Other people who are more likely to meet criteria for addiction are those people who are in poverty, whether it's intellectual poverty or economic poverty. Those people also have a higher propensity to meet criteria for drug addiction. Also, people who are subjected to chronic unrealistic expectations, they also have a higher propensity to meet criteria for drug addiction. The point is that when we think about drug addiction and reasons why people meet criteria for drug addiction, it's far more important to look at the psychosocial environment and environmental factors than to look at someone's brain. Because at the moment, the brain doesn't tell us much. It doesn't differentiate those people who meet criteria for addiction versus those who don't meet criteria for addiction. So when we think about brain imaging, one of the types of images that we use in substance abuse research is positron emission tomography. If you focus your attention on the slide, you can see on the left is someone who is in a control group. This person has never taken drugs. And on your right is someone who is methamphetamine dependent. Typically, the researcher will say, if you look at the picture on the left, you can see that that brain is lit up to a greater extent than the brain on the right. And you, the viewer, tend to think that that means something, when in fact it doesn't mean much, because you, the viewer, don't know what is the normal range. You don't know what is the normal sort of picture, what the normal picture should look like. And the researcher never tells you what is the normal range. There is a range of what the brain should look like, and that range is quite wide. Just like there is a range in terms of normal height distribution. You might have a male who is 5'8" versus another male who is 6'2". That's a large range in terms of height distribution. But we wouldn't say the 5'8" male is height deficient based on his comparison with the 6'2" male. We just say that there is a range of normality. The same is true when we look at brain imaging pictures focused on people who use drugs versus people who don't use drugs. And so these pictures tell you virtually no information, although many researchers will tell you that they are telling you that the methamphetamine users are somehow brain damaged. And that's just simply not true. That's not true based on the actual literature and data from the literature. We have reviewed the literature in a number of papers, and you can see that when you actually look at the data, the methamphetamine users or other substance use individuals are within the normal range. Their brains look just like those brains who have not used drugs. And so it's important for you, the viewer, the listener, to always ask the question, what is the normal range? What should a normal brain look like? What is the variability within that normal range? That's the important question to ask. Now, if we want to draw conclusions about drug addiction being a brain disease, we can also compare with other brain diseases, known brain diseases. When we think about brain diseases, I think about something like Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease. Both of those diseases are progressive, meaning that once they start, they continue, they're irreversible, and they are fatal, meaning that the person will ultimately die from symptoms related to the illness. And when we think about the brains of individuals who have Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease, one of the things that we can see is that in the midbrain area, this area we call the striatal area, we can see atrophy. We start to see that there's cell loss, and this progresses throughout the clinical manifestations of the disease or the illnesses. So you can see brain differences in Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease as the disease progresses. Now, when you think about something like drug addiction, it is not irreversible. It's not fatal. Most of the people who are treated, most of the people who recover don't even need treatment. And you do not see any neural correlates associated with drug addiction. That is, you can't look at the brains of someone who is addicted versus someone who is not and see a difference that's meaningful. You can't do it like you can with Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease. So the notion that drug addiction is a brain disease, it just does not hold up. And it certainly does not look like those other brain diseases that we're more familiar with, like Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease. Now, one of the concerns that I have when we think about drug addiction as a brain disease, or this focus of drug addiction as a brain disease, one of the things that it does is that it takes away the focus from resources that could actually help people who may be suffering from drug addiction. It also allows people to target those people who are identified as having a brain disease related to drug addiction. I'll give you an example. When I think about drug addiction as a brain disease, I think about the Philippines and their president, President Rodrigo Duterte. Duterte has said that something like methamphetamine use causes the human brain to shrink. And as a result of the methamphetamine causing the human brain to shrink, after a year or so of using this drug, he'd say that these people are irretrievable. And that means that we could actually kill them. And that's, in fact, that's what he does, or he has done. Thousands of people have been killed in the Philippines as a result of his war on drugs, specifically his war on methamphetamine. And he is justified in his mind because he thinks these people are brain damaged and irretrievable. And so when we think about the potential consequences of our sort of exclusive focus or unjustified focus on drug addiction as a brain disease, it provides cover for people like President Duterte and his sort of unfair treatment of those folks. Another concern related to thinking of drug addiction as a brain disease, it takes away resources from those things that we know actually works. We know that if people are employed, that if people they have their other mental illnesses treated, they have their pain treated, we know that this goes a long way in treating drug addiction. But the almost exclusive focus on drug addiction as a brain disease takes away funds and resources from those other areas. I should also point out, when we think about what we did in our country with crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, in 2010, we tried to reverse it somewhat. In 2010, under President Obama, we decreased the disparity in terms of the treatment of powder cocaine versus crack cocaine. Crack cocaine violations were punished 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine violations. In 2010, we passed legislation that decreased that disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. So now, today, crack cocaine violations are treated 18 times more harshly than powder cocaine violations. Again, powder cocaine and crack cocaine are exactly the same drug. So any sort of disparate treatment of the two is not justified by science. So the 2010 modification, while is a step in the right direction, still is insufficient and still inconsistent with science. I think Malcolm X speaks to this issue posthumously when he has said that if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, That's not justice. That's the same thing here. Or that's not progress. That's the same thing here. There should be no disparity between the way we punish crack cocaine and the way we punish powder cocaine. So like if we think about how should we go about dealing with the issue of drugs and the issue of the brain and drugs, the first thing we should do is we should make sure that we always keep the focus on people's behavior, not on their brains. In fact, it's too expensive to give everyone a brain imaging exam. So if you keep the focus on people's behavior, then you keep the focus on what the concern really is. The focus should be on the behavior and not the brain. We should also make sure that we have public service announcements done by scientists and science organizations like the National Institute on Drug Abuse to make sure that we caution against over-interpreting neuroimaging data because these over-interpretations have led to some abuses. The Duterte example in the Philippines is just one of the extreme examples, but there are others. And we should also make sure that we do a better job in terms of providing more honest drug education. While drug addiction is certainly a concern, we should understand that the majority of people who use drugs will never meet criteria for addiction. And we should save our resources for those who actually need and want our help. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting discussion. I appreciate it. I learned a lot. You started your talk with a quote from Baldwin, and so that immediately triggered in both me and my colleagues some questions about your own journey. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ernie Mahaffey, who is going to kick us off and talk a little bit about you before we talk a little bit more about then the substance of what you were talking about.
So, Dr.Carl Hart Day in Miami. I bet that's a celebration, and you should be proud of that and your family as well. What can you tell us about your journey from Miami and how then you become one of the earliest black tenured professors at Columbia? Give us some background on that. Barriers, mentors, what was it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a question that I dealt with in my first book, High Price, but just briefly. In the 1980s, as I briefly described, we were all concerned about crack cocaine. And growing up in a neighborhood, a predominantly black neighborhood like I did in Miami, I was concerned as well, and I wanted to make a contribution to my community. And so one of the ways I thought I could do that was by helping with this problem of drug addiction and helping to better understand crack's effects. And so as a result, after having gone in the military and spent 4 years in the military, I started to study neuroscience. And I figured that if I got good enough, I could help solve the problem of drug addiction. And then if I solved the problem of drug addiction, then peripherally, I could solve or help solve some of the problems that I thought were related to drug addiction, like high unemployment rates, poor education, those sort of issues I thought were direct causes from drug addiction. Of course, 30 years later, I know it's not that simple, and I no longer believe that, but that's how I got started. And along the way, of course, I had tons of mentors. I couldn't have done this without those mentors. Mentors at the University of Maryland, at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, at Wyoming, at Yale, at Columbia, even today, just mentors all along the way. We don't become successful without the help of other people. And so that's one of the sort of things that I'm trying to do with my life, is make sure that I contribute and help others as I've been helped.
And a further question on that, both Errol and I had positive military experiences. It sounds as if you did. But brain science is not something we would expect from an ordinary Air Force career. How did that come about?
Yeah, the brain science, that was after the military. The military just showed me that the world was bigger than Miami. And so as a result, it just showed me the possibilities. And neuroscience was one of those possibilities after the military. As you all might recall, I got out of the military in 1988. Between 1990 and 2000, President Bush 1 declared it or proclaimed it the decade of the brain. And that proclamation made sure that there would be funds for people to study brain science. And I was one of the recipients of that proclamation and the monies the American taxpayers' dollars supported. So that's how I really became interested in brain science, because between 1990 and 2000, the country was committed a lot of resources to make sure that we train people in the brain sciences.
Super. A lot of us joke that we don't suffer fools gladly. You tended to go a little further than that by indicating on your website that you try and avoid conversations with people who don't abide by the rules of evidence. And as we look at what's going on in our country today with seemingly, and again, I have to be careful when I'm talking to a scientist, that seemingly a larger number of people are ignoring scientific evidence on a host of issues. What are scientists feeling about that? Are you doing anything about it, or are you just saying we'll create the science, we'll put it out there, and it's up to the people, the media to accept it, and it's not really our job to make people try and understand what we're doing, because you're doing significant things, and I get concerned when just people ignore the science.
Yeah, that's a really great and complicated question, because on the one hand, we really don't want people to listen to scientists. That's not it. Because scientists, we have our own biases. We are products of our culture. Some of us may know, for example, that we use science to justify slavery. We use science to justify a whole host of things that are awful. And so I would encourage people to listen to the data, not the scientists. Listen, and I would encourage people to be more science literate, because the data are clear, regardless of what I say or anyone else says. Even in my field of drug addiction, many scientists have been political in that they aren't necessarily following the data. And so I would just encourage people to really understand the data or be more science literate. And it doesn't require much, but you are right. People are even ignoring the data. When we get into this vaccine sort of thing, we know vaccines in general work, but yet people are ignoring the data. I don't really care about personalities. I just want people to look at the data.
Mm-hmm. We had a very interesting speech earlier in the week, I believe, by one of your young colleagues at Columbia, who talked about the transmission of such things as fears through genetics and through generations. And she was focusing on a smell that followed by a shock, which could be transmitted to the offspring of that mouse. And so let me talk a little bit, because we have a question that came in from a listener about genetic factors. And the question is, and I'll read it, living with generations of addicts with mental illness, what do you see are the genetic factors that lead to addiction? Or is it in itself a genetic factor?
Well, again, sticking with the theme, looking at the data. When we look at the data, there are virtually no data that supports the notion that, for example, drug addiction is a genetic disorder. There is virtually no data. When we look at alcohol, for example, you can have rates that range from, concordance rates. When you look at monozygotic twins, you can have rates that range from about 5% to about 50%, but a lot of variability. And then when you look at any other drug, there's virtually no data to support this notion that drug addiction is a genetic disorder. Now, that's not to say that we don't see drug addictions in families. But when you see drug addiction in family, there are a whole host of complicated social environmental things that are going on. But one of the things that we do is we get intellectually lazy and we say, it's genetics, to be thrown into that wastebasket of things we don't understand. And I will encourage people not to do that. I will encourage people to do the work to find out what are those psychosocial environmental factors that are driving the things that concern them, like families that have drug addiction. We might have families that are more likely to do some other things as well. But to attribute it to genetics is oftentimes intellectually lazy. When we think about genetics and mental illness or behavioral disorders, Huntington's disease is the one that we have the best data that indicates that this is a genetic disorder. Anything else short of that, I am uncomfortable saying that it's a genetic disorder because the data aren't on my side to say that. So I can't say that.
Okay.
I have a couple of questions that relate to crack cocaine specifically. I know that we tend to denigrate that vis-a-vis powdered cocaine, and it becomes a discrimination issue and an us versus them kind of thing. But could you explain, is it true in your experience, and does the data support the fact that crack cocaine is more addictive?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. So I'm going to have to just go take a step back first and just talk about addiction in general and what we think as a field. So when we think about addiction, one of the important factors that we focused on is route of administration. That is how a drug is being taken. You can take a drug orally, you can smoke it, you can shoot it. Now, when you take a drug orally, it takes a long time in general, except alcohol. That's a little different. We'll set that aside. It takes a long time for the drug effects to be felt. Now, when you smoke a drug like crack cocaine or nicotine, the effects are felt immediately. Or when you shoot a drug intravenously into your veins, the effects are felt immediately because the drug gains access to the bloodstream immediately, and then it goes to the brain. Whereas orally, it takes a while before the drug gains access to the bloodstream. So we think one of the hypotheses or the major theories in our field is that the faster a drug reaches the brain, the more likely it will cause addiction. The faster the drug reaches the brain, the more addictive the drug is, basically. That's a major theory. When you look for data to support that theory, only limited data support that theory, but most of us believe that, so people understand. Now, back to crack, the question is crack more addictive than powder cocaine? Certainly, it can be more, smoking crack cocaine can be more addictive than snorting powder cocaine. But dissolving powder cocaine in water or saline and then injecting it intravenously, the drug reaches the brain just as quickly as smoking it. So powder cocaine and crack cocaine are essentially the same drug. The only difference we're talking about is route of administration. And people have conflated route of administration with crack versus powder. And so that's why we are concerned when crack cocaine violations are punished more harshly than powder cocaine violation. We don't do that with any other drug, and it is not justified.
And I believe you totally. But there was a time when 16 black congressional caucus members voted in favor of harsher public penalties for crack cocaine. Where do we stand? Where do we stand today?
You're absolutely right. 16 of the 20 black congressional caucus members certainly voted for that. That was in 1986. You're absolutely right. And James Baldwin at the same time told them that that was a mistake. He implored them not to do that sort of thing. And then in 1988, when that same law was re-upped, I think it was only 8 of those members voted to support the law, because by then they had learned that the current law, that law they voted for, exaggerated the harms associated with powder cocaine and differentially treated the two drugs unfairly. And so you're absolutely right. They made that mistake, and some of them tried to correct that mistake a couple years later. But several years later, in 2007, Barack Obama, when he ran for president, he said that he would get rid of the disparity between how powder and crack were treated, because he realized that the two should be treated the same. Of course, in 2010, they lessened the disparity from treating or punishing crack cocaine violations 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine violations. They lessened that disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. Again, that 18 to 1 is not justified either. But that's where we stand today. We punish crack cocaine violations 18 times more harshly than powder cocaine violations. We don't do that for any other drug.
I appreciate your position, and I certainly share it, but how do you look at the risk of drug legalization? Will that, from your perspective, increase the number of people using drugs, and therefore the number of people who potentially can become addicted and have substance abuse issues?
Yeah, thank you for that question. In terms of the number of people who will use drugs, certainly if you legally regulate drugs, like we have legally regulated alcohol, like we legally regulated tobacco, there is a possibility that more people will use these substances. The problem is not use. We as Americans shouldn't care what people use. We say that we are for people's liberty, and as long as people are responsible. So I'm not so much concerned about what people, how many people are using. My concern is that if people are having problems, if they become addicted, if they are overdosing or of that nature, those are the things that concern me. Now, the current situation is such that even though we have these laws that prohibit these substances, people are still using these substances. These substances are more dangerous under the conditions that people are using them today, because they don't know whether or not their substances contain adulterants. And as we know with opioids and so forth, some people are dying from adulterants like fentanyl. They think that they have heroin and they have fentanyl, which is more potent than heroin, meaning that smaller amounts of it is required to produce an effect. We saw a similar thing when we had alcohol prohibition. We had tens of thousands of Americans being maimed or killed between 1920 and 1933. Now, when we overturned the 18th Amendment that prohibited alcohol in 1933, those numbers of people being maimed and killed from alcohol dramatically decreased. And so I think that if we legally regulate the market, at least we can have quality control, at least we can have more honest education, at least we can take away stigma. All of these things, I think, will serve the society better than what we're currently doing.
My colleague and I are stimulated by your remarks, and we've got lots of questions, but I don't know whether it was this answer or the previous answer, but we've just had an explosion on our question portal, and they are pouring in. So as much as we'd like to keep to our questions, I'm obligated to go to a few that our users have said here. And again, one gets back to your colleague from Columbia earlier in the week. And she said, the question is, genetics was discussed, but how about epigenetics? Our earlier speaker from Columbia focused on epigenetics.
Yeah, how about epigenetics? Again, where are the data? There are no data that indicates that epigenetic is driving drug addiction. Not to say that we should be studying epigenetics, and we should, and that's absolutely fine. But I cannot justify saying that epigenetics is a crucial factor in maintaining drug addiction, or even the development of drug addiction. I just don't have the data to support that.
Let me do one more here. In your presentation, you seemed, and again, this is a question that has come in, this is not my view. In your presentation, you seemed very frustrated with both the state of research and its interpretations. Is one of those a bigger source of frustration than the other? And again, I guess that is the state of research, or is the interpretation of research, which is a bigger frustration for you?
Well, I think the state of research is actually really pretty good. Researchers are doing a really good job of collecting the data in a rigorous manner, and we can trust the data. But my concern becomes with the interpretations. Let me just point out something here. When you do science, particularly in the way we do with the big labs and so forth, you need millions of dollars to support your funding. And so as long as drug addiction is seen as this scourge, if you will, people are invested in to make sure that it's seen that way, so we can continue to pump money into these research labs, which is okay. I think people should receive money, but I don't think that they should have to exaggerate or interpret their findings in such a way that satisfies a funder. And I think that's the major problem, particularly when it comes to the study of drugs, because the study of drugs is almost exclusively focused on the negative outcomes associated with these drugs. When we think about the opioids, for example, the opioids have been some of the main friends of humans when it comes to combating pain throughout our history. Without opioids, we wouldn't have medications that save people from dysentery. Dysentery, you get diarrhea so badly you end up dying, which is still a problem in some countries. Without opioids, that problem does not go away. Without opioids, our immortal enemy, pain, would afflict many more of us. And so we oftentimes think about or talk about these drugs in this exclusive manner in which focuses on their negative outcomes without thinking about the beneficial effects of these drugs. Without cocaine, we don't have Novocaine. When you go to the dentist, you don't have the numbing in your mouth. Without cocaine was the first local anesthetic, and all the rest are like modifications of the cocaine structure. And so these conversations are oftentimes not had, and we only think about the negative effects of these drugs.
Okay, one last question before I turn it over to my colleague, and that is your views to some extent seem to align with the views of some libertarians or with those that can sometimes be described as anti-government people. Have you found any surprising allies in your work and any surprising opponents to your work?
Emphatically, yes to both, right? I'm not a libertarian. I'm an American, and I actually read the Declaration of Independence, and I read it on a regular basis because of this emphasis on liberty and this emphasis on responsibility. Now, that's not to say that we should take care of people, and that's that started out, people took care of me, or otherwise I wouldn't be here. Sometimes people think of the libertarian position as we have no responsibility for our fellow citizens. I don't believe that. I think we have responsibilities for our fellow citizens, and I want to do my part. But I think we should let people live their lives as they see fit, as long as they are not impeding other people's from doing the same. That means if you're going to be in the public space, that means you have to get vaccinated, because otherwise you are impacting other people's liberty. So you cannot negatively impact other people's liberty in pursuit of your rights. And so that's the founding of the country. That's not new. That's not mine. That's the Declaration of Independence. And so I'm not a libertarian, but yeah, some people think that, and then other people think that when you talk about liberty, you are somehow Republican or libertarian. I'm neither. I'm trying to be someone who respects other people and be there for my fellow citizens.
Great, thank you. Let me turn to Ernie.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and you're definitely expanding my horizons in some ways, so thank you for that. You talk pretty quickly, you immediately assert that as we liberalize, if we liberalize, we have to add regulation, we have to add testing, we have to add quality standards, we have to add, we have to learn how to manage these drugs and how they're administered and all of the above. And that's going on, or would appear to be going on, or supposed to be going on with marijuana now. Is it, and what are we learning?
Yeah, I think the marijuana question is a very interesting one, because we have, I don't know, at this point, about 19 different states that have legally regulated marijuana. And so we have like 19 different experiments going on. And the thing that you pointed out was, it'd be interesting to see how each state does with its education, how each state does with its regulating the unit dose, how much THC can be in each product, a small amount versus a larger amount based on the state that you're in. All of these experiments will provide information for us in terms of how we move forward in other states, how we might choose to move forward at the federal level. Some states, for example, are expunging the records of people who were convicted for marijuana-related felonies or misdemeanors in some states. So it's a very interesting sort of experiment that we have going on. Other states are using the tax revenue generated from marijuana to rectify some of the harms that's been done by the war on drugs to specific communities. So it's a fascinating time with marijuana. I'm really looking forward to seeing how we do, but I am in support of legal regulation of marijuana.
Again, let me say from your perspective that you have generated more questions on the portal than any other speaker we've had so far. So congratulations for that, and it helps us as well. But this is one you hear often. And again, it would be interesting to talk about what the data says here. What is the, again, the question is, what is the effect on a baby's brain or development, if any, when the mother is using drugs during the baby's gestation? And does a biological father's use of drugs affect the brain or other development of a subsequently conceived child? And I have heard that argument, or that's posed in the form of a question, but I have heard it used in the form of a statement to justify certain legal actions and remedies. And so what do the data say, if anything?
Yeah, so if we go back to 1986, one of the major drivers for the law that punished crack cocaine 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine was this notion of crack babies. Turns out there was no such thing as crack babies, and people exaggerated this. And when the dust had cleared, the effects of cocaine on the developing fetus were comparable to the effects of tobacco smoke on the developing fetus. If a mom smoked cigarettes, the effects were comparable. And so we exaggerated the harmful effects of smoke cocaine on the developing baby. Now, that's not to say that mothers should go out and smoke cocaine or any other drug during pregnancy. That's not what I'm saying. Mothers should be healthy, eat well, and do all those things that we all know. What I'm saying is that we exaggerated the effects. Now, we know from alcohol quite well some of the effects on the developing fetus. Now, with alcohol, in order to see fetal alcohol syndrome, a woman has to drink really heavily to have these effects such that they show up in physical features of the child or intellectual features of the child, developing child. And so when we think about drug use on the developing fetus, the effects have been wildly overstated. Oftentimes, particularly in the early stages of pregnancy, the mother does not even know that she's pregnant, and she may have been taking alcohol and doing a number of other things. And most of us are fine. Again, this is not to encourage people to go out and use drugs during pregnancy. I discourage that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the evidence certainly does not support these dire conclusions or predictions that people have made when the pregnant person is using drugs. But typically when people become pregnant and they know it, their drug use drops off precipitously.
Thank you for that. And I'm not sure that you didn't answer this question, but it just came in, so I'm going to pose it so that you can reinforce an answer. And it says, please distinguish between mental health and irreversible brain disease. Might drug abuse be a disease that does not affect the brain in obvious ways, a disease that can be addressed by talk therapy combined with medical therapy?
Yes, that question answers yes. Drug use certainly, most people who are addicted to drugs or become addicted to drugs get better with talk therapy or without any therapy. And so, yes to that question.
Okay, I'll turn a question to my colleague.
Thank you. I wasn't prepared, but I will be. So, yes, after many years of alcohol use, I'm no longer a user. I became concerned about certain things, but also one of the things that I genuinely was concerned about was that I was losing brain cells, that I was destroying my brain, I was injuring myself. And my doctors helped me to understand that was probably true. Please elucidate on that.
Well, I'll talk about alcohol in general. I can't say your specific situation. So when we think about alcohol and people who drink heavily, so there are, as I get older, I don't do alcohol, alcohol, there are far better drugs for older people than alcohol. So if people are drinking heavily, oftentimes it means they are not getting proper nutrition. And when you don't get your vitamins and minerals, you certainly can have some neurotoxicity in extreme cases. You certainly can have some cell damage in extreme cases. And this is related primarily to poor nutrition and in terms of the amount of alcohol that's required to damage your brain cells. I think those levels are so high that you probably won't be functioning well enough to take a drink. And so when we think about any toxicity related to alcohol use, it's these peripheral things like not eating well, not sleeping well, not doing all of these other things that become far more dangerous to you, to your health, than alcohol itself. And then when we think about alcohol's impact, potential impact on the liver, particularly chronic alcohol use, the liver is such an important organ for breaking down substances in our bodies, particularly substances that could be harmful and so forth. And if you damage that, then you run the risk of causing yourself all kinds of other problems. So yeah, heavy alcohol use over extended years of use is probably not the smartest thing to do. But when alcohol is the only psychoactive substance available to a population, it's not surprising that that population chooses alcohol. That's a concern.
You prefaced your last answer by saying that there were better drugs for older people, and so I need to touch base with you offline on that. We won't do this live on camera, but we are near the end of our hour, and so tell us the answer to the question we should have asked, or give us a few concluding thoughts, if you will, before we move on to next week's program.
The answer to the question that you should have asked, you asked great questions, so I don't know what to say there. The important thing that I like people to take away from this is this. Please don't listen to me. Look at the data. If you have some concern or you disagree, that's okay. The data will set us all free. Please look at the data. We oftentimes have talked about drug addiction as it's a brain disease. The problem is that there are no data to support that. And another problem related to that is that it prevents us from looking at the whole person and the person's environment. And those sort of issues, those factors, are a lot more malleable and a lot more accessible to us to help the person who may be struggling than looking at a person's brain. There's not much that you can do to help that person if you're only looking at their brain. And so if you really care about someone struggling with the problem of drug addiction, please look at the entire individual. Is the individual being subjected to unreasonable demands on a chronic basis? Has the person recently lost their job, their self-worth? All of these issues become far more important. And if you look at the entire person, it might mean that you are a compassionate person, and compassion is good. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for a wonderful discussion, a discussion where you exposed your vulnerabilities, a discussion where you highlighted the changing of the focus of your research, and I think those changes will certainly benefit all of us in society. So on behalf of the African American Heritage House and my colleague Ernie here today, thank you for a thoroughly enjoyable and certainly enlightening presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you. For those of you who are listening, I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. As I noted, it is the penultimate presentation of the season. We'll be back next week with one more presentation in week 10 of the assembly season. I would ask all of you to pay some attention to our website to see what we're going to do during the off season. We will be gearing up the Mirror Project once again in some form or another. That we are still in the planning stages of that, but we will be launching rather quickly. Our goal is to get something up and running by October. So again, thank you very much for your time, your attention, and again, as I noted earlier, for the support that you've continued to provide us to allow us to present fabulous speakers such as we had today. Thank you. Have a good rest of your week.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.